Meantime, high-level negotiations between the U.S. and China resumed today in Washington, with news circulating that the two countries have reportedly sketched out a potential deal. This is something the markets have been waiting for. This is coming as the trade war, of course, has been impacting Wall Street, and it's been very volatile. According to Renaissance Macro Research, the S&P 500 could have been 11% higher than where it is now if President Trump hadn't adopted his protectionist stance on global commerce. Positive developments on trade have helped the S&P advance by 107 points this year, but that's still not enough to cover all the trade-related losses. Joining us now is Tiger 21 Chairman Michael Sonnenfeldt, along with Yale University China Center's Senior Fellow and former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, Susan Thorton. Michael, let's go ahead and start with you. Your thoughts on what's happening in the China trade negotiations right now. The president has said he's more flexible about that deadline. Maybe we have a sketch, maybe we don't. It changes every day.
So our members are from basic industries. Of all of the things the president has done, this one policy gets the highest marks. You can't have a world trade system without having a level playing field, and unless China stops some of its bad habits, you just can't compete effectively. So this is one area that our members are quite appreciative of.
Susan, I want to get your take on this as well. Washington obviously is focused on this, and so is Wall Street. How quickly do you think it's realistic to get a resolution?
Well, I think certainly the Trump administration is trying to get a deal here in the next month, and there's a March 1st deadline on the tariffs. Maybe Xi Jinping is going to meet with President Trump next month. So I think there'll be some kind of interim deal here within the next month. There is still a struggle going on among the Trump administration insiders about how hard to push. I think the bigger problem is how to keep the Chinese on the implementation of any deal, how to measure up if they're following through on what they've promised to do. And I think that that's probably what the struggle is over right now.
Michael, back to you for a second. If an agreement is reached in a speedy, fashion and in a good way, that's not, very volatile, it seems like the S&P, the Dow, they would react very positively. How much upside could there potentially be on that news? Or is most of it now priced in?
I think the best way to say it is that the basic business climate would be positive. I can't put a point number on it, but for our members that have felt they've been unfairly competed against, this would open up opportunities for investment, for new ways of doing business, and frankly restore some of the confidence that's been lost. When you're a basic entrepreneur and every time you build a new product, a counterfeit product shows up within 24 hours in China, it's hard to make an investment in new products. If that stops, it'll make a huge difference.
It's difficult, but still opponents to President Trump's policies here on trade will say that it will damage companies more than it will help them. The president would fight back and say it might be a short-term hit, but long-term, this is definitely doing the right thing.
So they're definitely positive arguments in both ways, but I think there's a distinction between tariffs and leveling the playing field. If you're stealing our intellectual property, that has to stop. If you're unfairly competing or dumping, that has to stop. That's almost a different story than tariffs and quotas, which different people feel differently about.
Susan, China reporting the slowest growth in almost 30 years. It doesn't sound to me like they have that much leverage coming to the negotiating table.
Well, I think they have some leverage because they can absorb a lot through their state sort of levers that are in control of their economic system. But I think Michael is right. The tariffs have gotten the Chinese attention, and now the real point is to try to capitalize on that leverage. Most people don't want to see tariffs levied or continue to be imposed. That's disruptive, destabilizing. And I think the question now is how to use those tariffs to get changes on the structural issues that Michael was talking about.
All right, let's go a step beyond the tariffs for a second. That's only one of the issues on investors' mind right now that are Washington related. If we get a resolution on tariffs, what becomes your next focus point?
Probably the Fed and interest rates. That's clearly been on our story. Has the Fed slowed down because they're seeing something that others haven't? Had they reached too far? But right now, with a $1 trillion deficit, people have been around long enough suspect one day we're going to wake up and the bond market is going to take a real dive if we don't address the deficit. So there's a lot of different views on how important a $1 trillion deficit is.
And what would be the ways to address it?
Well, first of all, stay away from long-term debt. For the first time, our members are investing in short-term debt. When interest rates were zero, there was no point in doing that. But in a 2 to 3% mark, short-term debt makes sense. Looking at industries that have moats that can do well in the case of a rise in interest rates. Obviously, housing would be affected in a significant way.
Well, part of the story, of course, is how the Fed will act. But Susan, back to you. China is a big holder of U.S. debt.
Yeah, I think that they'll continue to hold debt and not try to use that in the course of this negotiation. I mean, there's a lot of different factors. Their economy is de facto integrated with ours in many ways. And so this is big stakes for them. And I think it's big stakes for us that we try to get this right and get back onto some kind of a constructive path with them.
All right, Susan, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Fantastic conversation.